Rain hit the asphalt like shards of glass. The highway was empty, a black ribbon twisting through the Oregon woods under a bruised sky. Emma gripped the steering wheel tighter, her wipers struggling to keep up. She shouldn't have been out there, not with the storm clawing at the world like that. But silence had been heavier at home than the thunder outside. Then she saw it. Something small, a flicker of motion at the edge of her headlights. She hit the brakes. The tires screamed. For a moment, everything froze except for the rain hammering on the hood. There, by the guardrail, was a cardboard box, soaked through, collapsing, and inside, a faint cry, thin, trembling, desperate. Emma stepped into the cold, the wind slicing through her jacket. Her flashlight caught a pair of eyes reflecting back, wide, terrified, gold like melted amber. "Hey there, little one," she whispered. It was a kitten, or so she thought, small enough to fit in her hands, shivering, bones sharp beneath wet fur. Someone had left it to die. She wrapped it in her scarf, tucking it close to her chest. The creature trembled, then pressed its head weakly against her neck. Emma felt its heartbeat, fast, wild, fragile. "Don't worry," she murmured. "You're safe now." By the time she reached her cabin, her fingers were numb. The wind howled through the pines, carrying the scent of snow. Inside, the fire crackled to life, and she placed the bundle on a towel near the hearth. The little body stirred, letting out a sound, soft, yet oddly rough, like a growl buried beneath a purr. She frowned but smiled anyway. "You've got some spirit, huh?" The creature blinked at her, almost studying her. Emma laughed at herself. "It's just a kitten," she told her mind, but something in that gaze made her hesitate. Its pupils were round. No, not quite. More like slits. Still, loneliness was louder than reason. She found an old bowl, poured some warm milk, and watched the tiny animal lap it up greedily. Then it looked up again, milk dripping from its whiskers, and let out a short, rasping sound, half purr, half rumble. Outside, lightning split the sky. The cabin lights flickered. For a heartbeat, Emma saw its silhouette stretch against the wall, longer, leaner, wild. When the light steadied, it was small again. Harmless. She wrapped herself in a blanket and sat near it, exhaustion weighing down her eyelids. The storm raged on, but the little creature had already curled into her sweater, asleep. Emma closed her eyes too, not seeing how the flicker of the fire caught the faint markings forming along its fur. Spots, like shadows from another world. Somewhere in the distance, through the crash of rain and thunder, came a cry. Not of a kitten, but something deeper. A mother calling for her lost one. Emma stirred in her sleep, unaware that fate had already chosen her. Unaware that the tiny heartbeat against her chest did not belong to a pet, but to the wild. If she had known what it truly was, would she still have stopped that night? Morning came wrapped in mist. The forest outside Emma's cabin was a frozen sea of white, where pine branches drooped under the weight of snow and silence felt like a living thing. Inside, her old kettle hissed softly, the sound echoing through the small wooden room. She moved like someone used to quiet, her every step careful, her motions deliberate, pouring tea into a chipped mug, rubbing her hands for warmth, then gazing out the window as if waiting for something that never came. The calendar on the wall still showed December, though it was nearly February. She hadn't crossed out the days since her mother's death 6 months ago. Maybe she didn't want to. Maybe pretending time had stopped made it hurt less. Her job at the town's animal shelter had ended when funding ran out. Too remote, they said. too few visitors. Now she worked from home, taking freelance design projects, sending sketches to strangers she'd never meet. The only sound that broke the stillness was her guitar, soft notes drifting through the cold air, like ghosts of conversations she no longer had. Every morning, she walked to the river's edge. The ice there glimmered faintly, cracked in delicate spider webs. She always looked for prints of deer, foxes, birds. Sometimes she found paw marks larger than any cat's, fading into the tree line. She'd kneel and touch them, smiling to herself. "You're out there somewhere, huh?" she'd whisper. There was comfort in believing the woods were watching her back. On her way home, she'd pass the old fence that separated her property from the deep forest. There, hanging loosely from a nail, was her mother's wind chime. 5 silver tubes that sang only when the wind came from the north. Its sound reminded her of childhood winters, of laughter in the kitchen, of stories told by the fire about spirits that guarded the mountains. That morning, the wind was still, yet the chime moved. A soft, trembling note. She frowned, stepped closer, and noticed something at the base of the fence. A tuft of fur caught on the wire. Pale gray with dark spots. "Coyote?" she murmured. But no. The hairs were shorter, denser, wild in a way she couldn't name. She tucked them into her pocket without knowing why. Inside, the kitten still slept in its basket by the fire. Its breathing was steady now, its body curled tight. Emma crouched beside it, brushing her finger over its ear. It twitched, and a faint growl vibrated against her skin. For some reason, the sound didn't scare her. It felt right. She whispered, "You're safe here, little one." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft as ash, and through the flakes, unseen beyond the trees, 2 golden eyes watched from the shadows, silent, patient, waiting. The days that followed felt quieter than usual, but not empty anymore. The cabin, once filled only with the whisper of wind through cracks in the wood, now carried the soft rhythm of small paws against the floor. Emma named the kitten Ash because of its gray coat and the way it blended into the smoke from the hearth. Ash was different from any cat she'd cared for. It didn't meow. It chirped, hissed softly, and sometimes made low, throaty rumbles that vibrated in her chest when she held it. Its eyes, golden and alert, followed her every movement with uncanny focus. When she sat down to draw, Ash would climb onto her shoulder, curling around her neck like a living scarf. "Guess you're my shadow now," she'd laugh. She began talking to it, about her mother, about the town she no longer visited, about the emptiness that had followed her since the funeral. Ash never looked away. It simply listened, tail flicking like a heartbeat. Sometimes, when her voice cracked, it would press its nose to her cheek, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. Outside, winter deepened. The river froze completely, and the forest turned silent, but for the occasional caw of a crow. The neighbors, few and far between, came less often. The mailman stopped delivering up the mountain when the roads iced over. Emma didn't mind. She had Ash now. At night, though, the world seemed to breathe differently. Once, she woke to a sound at the window, scratching, low and steady. She peered through the frost-glazed glass, but saw nothing but trees and moonlight. Behind her, Ash sat up suddenly, fur bristling, ears flat. Its tiny body went still, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the glass. Then, just as quickly, it relaxed, curling back into the blanket. She told herself it was nothing, maybe a raccoon, maybe the wind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there, watching. By morning, fresh snow had covered the world in silence again. She found a trail of prints outside her porch, large, round, with distinct claw marks. They didn't belong to any cat she knew. Still, she smiled faintly, whispering, "Looks like we've got company, huh?" That evening, as she played her guitar, Ash watched the firelight flicker across the floor. Its eyes shimmered with reflections of flame and frost, ancient and wild. For a moment, Emma felt the strangest sense of recognition, like she'd seen those eyes before, long before this night, in some dream of snow and stars. When the song ended, Ash crawled onto her lap, its small claws pricking gently against her skin. She looked down at it and whispered, "Maybe we were both lost when we found each other." Outside, the wind picked up again. The old wind chime at the fence began to sing, a haunting, beautiful sound that carried through the night like a promise or a warning. The first sign came on a Sunday morning. The storm had passed, leaving the forest hushed and heavy beneath a new blanket of snow. Emma stirred from sleep to the sound of glass breaking. She sat up, heart pounding, scanning the room. The kitchen window was open, wide, though she was sure she'd locked it. Snow had drifted in, melting into puddles across the counter. And there, crouched beside the broken mug on the floor, was Ash. The kitten's fur bristled, its body low, eyes fixed on something outside. Emma followed its gaze, nothing but trees swaying in the wind. Still, Ash's growl was low and primal, the kind of sound that made the hairs on her arms rise. "Hey, it's okay," she whispered, stepping closer. But when she reached out, Ash turned suddenly, tail puffed, ears flat. For a heartbeat, it didn't recognize her. Its pupils had narrowed into sharp, vertical slits, and the muscles along its shoulders rippled with a strength that didn't belong to a house cat. Then, just as quickly, it relaxed. It padded over and brushed against her leg, purring as if nothing had happened. Emma exhaled slowly, her pulse still racing. "You scared me," she murmured, forcing a smile. She cleaned up the glass and closed the window tight. But as she turned away, she noticed the fresh snow outside the sill, marred by tracks. Not small, delicate prints, but large ones, spaced wide apart. She frowned, tracing the pattern with her eyes. Whatever had made those tracks was no kitten. That afternoon, Mr. Cole, her elderly neighbor, stopped by with a basket of wood. He was one of the few people who still checked on her. His face was carved deep by years of mountain wind, his coat smelling faintly of pine and tobacco. "Still got that cat?" he asked, nodding toward the fireplace where Ash slept, its chest rising and falling beneath the light. "Yeah," she said. "I found him during the storm." He squinted, stepping closer. "That ain't no cat, Miss Emma," she laughed. "Come on, Mr. Cole, he's just a little. Look at the paws." His voice was firm now. "And the ears. Wide, rounded. That's a Bobcat Cub if I've ever seen one." Her smile faded. "A bobcat? Wild thing. Shouldn't be raised indoors. Its mother's probably still out there." Emma looked down at Ash. The cub was awake now, staring at the old man, its golden eyes glinting in the firelight. Calm, unreadable, almost aware. "I can't just throw him out there to die," she said softly. Cole sighed. "You don't have to, but you can't keep what belongs to the wild." After he left, silence filled the cabin again. Emma sat beside Ash, her hand hovering over its back. Its fur was warm beneath her fingers, but the heartbeat she felt there was strong, too strong. She whispered, almost to herself. "You're not what I thought you were, are you?" Ash blinked slowly, tail curling around her wrist, as if answering without words. Outside, the forest exhaled. Somewhere far away, a howl rose and faded into the night. That night, sleep refused to come. Emma lay awake, listening to the whisper of the wind and the faint creak of the cabin settling. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mr. Cole's expression, the mix of concern and certainty when he said, "You can't keep what belongs to the wild." The fire had burned low, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Ash slept near the hearth, paws twitching in some dream. In the dim light, the markings on its fur were more distinct than ever. Dark rosettes, faint but spreading, like the pattern of a storm forming beneath its skin. She reached out, brushing her fingers through its fur. It was softer than snow, warm against her chilled hands. The cub stirred, half awake, and gave a short, rumbling purr that sounded almost like a growl. Emma smiled tiredly. "You don't scare me," she whispered. But deep down, she knew she was lying, to herself more than anyone else. The next morning, she took her laptop and began searching. Bobcat cubs, identification, markings, behavior. Each image she found made her stomach tighten. The resemblance was undeniable. The ears, the tail, the eyes. She looked over her shoulder at Ash, now perched on the windowsill watching a bird outside, muscles coiled, movements precise. It wasn't a kitten. It never had been. Still, as she watched it turn and blink at her, she felt something deeper than fear, something that pulled at her chest like invisible thread. Later that day, she wrapped Ash in a blanket and stepped outside. The forest air bit her skin, the scent of pine sharp and clean. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she walked toward the fence line, where the world turned from human to wild. "This is your home," she murmured, kneeling down. "You're free now." The cub didn't move. It looked up at her, blinking slowly, its breath forming little clouds in the cold air. Then, instead of running, it pressed against her knee and let out a low, throaty sound, half plea, half defiance. Emma's chest tightened. "Don't do that," she whispered, voice breaking. "Don't make this harder." But when she stood, Ash followed, small paws stepping into her footprints one after another. Something inside her cracked. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was love. Or maybe, for the first time, she just couldn't let go of something that needed her. She scooped it up, holding the cub close to her chest. Its heart raced against hers, wild, untamed, alive. "Okay," she said softly. "Then we'll figure it out together." When she looked up, snow had begun to fall again. Thick, slow flakes drifting through the quiet. The forest stood still, as if listening. Far beyond the trees, a shape moved, a shadow that paused, then disappeared into white. She didn't see it. She didn't know that something larger was watching from the distance, eyes glowing faintly gold. By the time she turned back to the cabin, she was smiling for the first time in months. Fate had offered her a choice, and though she didn't yet understand the cost, Emma had already made it. Winter deepened, and so did the silence. The river froze solid now, its surface smooth as glass. Every morning, Emma shoveled the snow from the porch while Ash padded beside her, leaving a trail of paw prints that looked almost too large for his body. He had grown quickly, too quickly. The once tiny creature that could curl into her hands now reached her knees when he stood on all fours. But she didn't see danger. She saw survival. When she cooked, he'd sit by the stove, watching with sharp, intent eyes. When she sang to herself, he'd tilt his head, ears twitching to the rhythm of her voice. At night, he slept at the foot of her bed, his breathing steady and low, a sound that had become her lullaby. The townsfolk rarely came by anymore. The few who did, delivery men, neighbors from the valley, kept their distance. Rumors had started. That girl up the mountain keeps a wildcat. Emma heard whispers when she went into town for supplies. She ignored them. People feared what they didn't understand. She understood Ash. He never clawed at her again. He never bit. When she tripped on the icy steps once, he rushed to her, pressing his body against her legs as if to steady her. And one morning, when a fox came too close to the henhouse, Ash lunged forward with a snarl so fierce it made her heart seize. The fox fled, tail between its legs. Emma scolded him at first, then realized the truth. He wasn't hunting. He was protecting. Still, strange things began happening. Dead mice appeared neatly placed at her doorstep. Broken branches littered the snow near her window, as if something, or someone, had climbed the trees to watch her home. And then there were the dreams. In them, Emma walked through an endless forest, the snow glowing blue beneath a silver moon. Somewhere ahead, eyes glimmered in the dark, golden, familiar. A voice she couldn't quite hear whispered her name, soft but wild, like wind through leaves. She would wake to find Ash sitting at the edge of her bed, watching her with those same eyes. One morning, she found him outside the cabin, crouched by the fence, growling low. She followed his gaze and froze. Across the snowfield stood another bobcat, larger, sleek, with the same spotted coat. It watched them silently before turning and slipping into the trees. "Is that your family?" she whispered. Ash turned his head to her, expression unreadable. Then he brushed against her hand, as if to say, "This is my family now." That night, she wrote in her old leather journal, the one her mother had given her years ago. Maybe this is what Mom meant when she said love doesn't always look the way we expect. Maybe sometimes it has claws and teeth and golden eyes. Outside, the forest exhaled frost. The wind chimes sang softly. Emma closed her eyes, listening to the faint hum of Ash's breathing beside her, and felt, for the first time since her mother's passing, safe. She didn't yet see the shadow, moving beyond the fence, pacing silently beneath the trees, watching, waiting. Because in the wild, nothing stays peaceful for long. By mid-February, the snow began to soften, melting into streams that whispered through the forest. But inside the cabin, the air felt heavier. Emma noticed the changes first in small things. How Ash's paws left deeper impressions in the mud, how his shoulders rippled beneath his thickening coat, how the playful chirps had turned into deeper growls that echoed through the trees. He was no longer a kitten. He was a young predator. One afternoon, she caught sight of him stalking the edge of the clearing, crouched low, every muscle trembling with intent. A rabbit darted across the snow. In a blur, Ash lunged, swift, silent, merciless. When Emma reached him, the kill was already done. The sight made her stomach twist, but Ash looked up at her with calm, unashamed eyes. He dropped the rabbit at her feet, tail flicking proudly. Her hands trembled. "No, you don't have to do that." He just stared, head tilted. To him, it was a gift, a proof of loyalty. That night, she buried the rabbit beneath the old oak, whispering apologies to both the forest and the creature that had died. Ash sat nearby, silent, watching her with an expression she couldn't name, something between confusion and hurt. The next morning, Mr. Cole came knocking. His breath steamed in the cold air, his face grim. "Something killed 2 of my hens," he said. "Left prints all over my yard." Emma froze. "You think it was—" "I don't think," he interrupted. "I know. It's that bobcat you've been keeping." Her chest tightened. "He wouldn't—" But Cole raised a hand. "You can't keep pretending, girl. That thing's wild. It'll turn on you sooner or later." When he left, she stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the tracks in the snow. Round, sharp-edged, unmistakably feline. But they led away from the house, not toward it. That night, she set a bowl of food by the fire and waited. Ash came in from the woods, his fur dusted with snow, eyes glinting like molten amber. She whispered, "Tell me it wasn't you." He didn't answer, of course. He only pressed his head against her arm, a gesture of peace. But when she touched his fur, she felt something crusted near his paw. Blood, half-dried. Her breath caught. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. For hours after, she sat by the fire, staring into the flames. She remembered her mother's stories about how love could be both light and fire, warmth and danger. She wondered if she had made the same mistake her mother once warned her about, mistaking wildness for love. Still, when Ash climbed beside her and rested his heavy head on her lap, she didn't move. Her fingers found his ear, tracing the soft curve there, and the fear slowly melted into something else, something like surrender. The next day, she went into town for the first time in weeks. The air inside the general store felt thick with whispers. People turned when she entered. "That's her," someone muttered. "The girl with the wildcat." Emma pretended not to hear. She bought milk, candles, and cat food, even though she knew he didn't eat that anymore. On her way out, Mrs. Kent, the store owner, caught her arm. "Emma," she said softly, "you need to let that animal go. They'll come for it soon. And when they do, they won't ask you nicely." Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, swirling in thin, restless spirals. Emma stood there for a long time, clutching the bag to her chest, feeling the weight of every word. When she returned home, Ash was waiting by the porch, eyes bright in the twilight. The moment she saw him, the tension in her chest loosened. Whatever the world thought, whatever fear whispered in her mind, none of it mattered when he looked at her that way. Still, somewhere deep down, she knew the world would not leave them alone forever. And neither would the wild. Spring came late that year. The snow melted slow and stubborn, revealing a forest still haunted by frost. The air smelled of pine and thawing earth. Emma had grown used to the rhythm of their life. Quiet mornings, long days of sketching by the window, evenings beside the fire with Ash curled at her feet. He was magnificent now. His fur shimmered with shades of silver and smoke, his body lean and powerful. When he moved, the world seemed to pause, a ripple of grace and danger in every step. Yet with her, he was gentle. When she read aloud, he listened. When she played guitar, he pressed his head against her knee, purring deep enough to make the floorboards vibrate. But sometimes, when dusk fell and the forest came alive, she saw something change in him. His eyes would shift, brighter, sharper. His ears twitched to sounds she couldn't hear. Once, she caught him standing at the window, staring into the dark with such focus it chilled her. She followed his gaze but saw only the woods, silent, endless. "Do you miss it?" she whispered once, her hand brushing his fur. "The wild?" He didn't move, but his tail flicked once, slow and deliberate. Nights grew restless. She started hearing noises, low cries carried on the wind, sometimes answered by Ash's deep, rolling growl. The forest wasn't empty anymore. Something out there was calling to him. Then came the night of the storm. Rain hammered the cabin roof. Thunder rolled through the mountains like falling boulders. Emma woke to find the front door wide open. Snow and mud streaked across the floor. Her heart seized. "Ash?" she called. No answer. She ran out barefoot into the rain, flashlight trembling in her hand. The storm howled around her, soaking her hair, stealing her breath. She followed the prints through the mud, deep, strong, leading toward the river. At the edge of the clearing, she froze. Lightning flashed, and there he was. Ash, facing off with another bobcat, larger, wild, eyes gleaming like twin suns. They circled each other, muscles tense, teeth bared. "No!" she screamed, stepping forward. "Stop!" But the wildcat lunged first, a blur of claws, fur, and thunder. Ash met it with a roar that seemed to shake the earth. Emma's flashlight hit the ground, the beam slicing through chaos, teeth flashing, blood spattering snow. "Ash!" He turned at her voice, and in that split second of hesitation, the other bobcat struck. Ash stumbled back, a gash blooming red along his side. Emma ran forward without thinking, shoving between them, waving her arms. "Get away!" she shouted, her voice breaking. The wild bobcat hissed, then melted back into the trees. She dropped to her knees beside Ash, cradling his head. Hey, look at me," she whispered, her voice shaking, blood soaked into her sleeve, hot against her skin. "You're okay. You're okay." He blinked slowly, his breathing shallow. Rain fell harder, washing away the blood, leaving streaks of crimson in the mud. By the time she got him back to the cabin, her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She cleaned the wound, wrapped it as best she could. He didn't resist, just watched her, eyes half-lidded, trusting. When the storm finally broke, dawn crept through the window in pale gold. Emma sat beside him, exhausted, tears streaking her cheeks. "I can't lose you," she whispered. "Not you too." He lifted his head weakly, pressing it against her chest. His breath was ragged, but his eyes, those fierce, golden eyes, held her gaze steady. And in that moment, she understood. He had fought not to kill, but to protect. Not himself. Her. Outside, the forest was still. The snow had melted into dark earth, and in the quiet that followed, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. But somewhere deep within, Emma knew it wouldn't last. Because love, especially the kind born between two different worlds, always asks for something back. For a few days, peace pretended to return. The wound along Ash's side had begun to heal, though a faint scar marked where the other bobcat's claws had cut deep. Emma stayed by his side, feeding him broth with a spoon, whispering the same words over and over. "You're safe. You're home." But safety, she soon learned, was only an illusion. The forest no longer felt like hers. Hunters' tracks appeared along the ridges. Voices echoed in the distance. Men calling to one another, their words sharp and angry. Once, she found a snare hidden near the river, its wire glinting in the sun. She cut it apart with trembling hands and buried the pieces beneath the snow. When she went into town to restock supplies, the atmosphere changed. Conversation stopped when she entered the store. A poster had been nailed to the bulletin board near the door. "Wildlife alert. Bobcat attacks reported. Keep pets and livestock indoors." She felt her stomach drop. Mrs. Kent avoided her eyes as she rang up the items. "They're saying it's the one you've been keeping," she said quietly. Cole's been talking to the sheriff. Emma's throat tightened. That's ridiculous. He hasn't hurt anyone. Mrs. Kent hesitated, then lowered her voice. I believe you, dear, but others won't. They're scared. You know how this town is. The drive home felt longer than ever. Snow flurries danced in the headlights, and for the first time, Emma noticed how isolated her cabin really was. How far from the safety of other people. How close to the edge of everything wild. When she returned, Ash greeted her at the door, his gait steady but cautious. He brushed against her leg, purring softly, and for a moment, the fear dissolved. She knelt, burying her fingers in his fur. They don't know you, she whispered. They don't understand. That night, the forest was restless. Dogs barked in the valley, and somewhere beyond the trees, a gunshot cracked through the dark. Ash's ears twitched. He lifted his head, muscles tensing. Don't, she said quickly. Stay here. But his instincts were older than her words. He moved to the window, eyes catching the moonlight, every line of his body sharpened by instinct. Emma stepped closer, heart pounding. Ash! He turned to her, gaze flickering between her and the forest, between safety and the call of something he couldn't ignore. Then, with a low growl that sounded almost like sorrow, he slipped through the door she forgot to latch and vanished into the night. She chased after him barefoot in the snow, the cold biting her skin. Ash! Come back! Her voice was swallowed by the wind. In the distance, another gunshot rang out. She froze, breath caught in her throat, eyes scanning the tree line. Only silence answered. Then, just faintly, she heard it. A cry, low and guttural, fading into the storm. And for the first time since she'd found him, Emma felt truly afraid. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the forest was unrecognizable. Branches hung heavy with ice, and the ground glittered with shards of frozen snow. Emma barely felt the cold as she stumbled through the trees, calling his name again and again. Ash! Come on, boy, where are you? Her breath came out in sharp clouds. The tracks she found were faint, paw prints half filled with fresh snow, leading deeper into the woods. She followed them until they reached a clearing she'd never seen before. There, pressed into the snow, were signs of a struggle. Deep claw marks, patches of fur, a smear of blood that glowed dark against the white. Her chest tightened. She knelt, touching the blood with trembling fingers. It was still warm. Somewhere behind her, a voice called out. Emma! She turned to see Mr. Cole approaching, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his face hard as the ice beneath their feet. What are you doing out here? He demanded. I'm looking for him. You shot at something last night, didn't you? He didn't answer right away. His jaw worked, eyes darting toward the clearing. You shouldn't be out here alone. Where is he, Cole? Her voice cracked. He sighed, lowering his rifle. We found him near the creek this morning. Sheriff took him to the ranger station. Emma felt her world tilt. He's alive? For now, Cole said. But he's hurt bad. They think he attacked livestock. The sheriff called fish and wildlife. They'll decide what to do. She didn't wait to hear more. She ran. By the time she reached the ranger station, her lungs burned and her hands were numb. 2 trucks were parked out front, their lights flashing weakly in the daylight. A small crowd had gathered, men in heavy coats, their breath rising like smoke. When she pushed through the door, the air reeked of disinfectant and fear. And there he was. Ash, in a metal cage at the back of the room. His fur was matted with blood, his breathing shallow but steady. The moment he saw her, he lifted his head, golden eyes locking onto hers. "Emma, stop," one of the rangers said as she ran to the cage. "It's dangerous." "He's not dangerous," she cried. "He's hurt." The man shook his head. "Ma'am, this animal killed livestock and nearly attacked a hunter. We can't let you near it." "That's not true." She knelt by the cage, ignoring them. "Ash, it's okay. I'm here." The bobcat pressed his paw against the bars, claws curling weakly around the cold metal. Emma reached out until their fingertips met through the gap. His eyes softened. Recognition, trust, and something like apology flickered there. Then Cole's voice broke through the tension. "Emma, they're going to put him down." The words hit harder than the wind outside. She turned slowly. "No, you can't. He didn't do anything wrong." "It's not my choice," Cole said quietly. "They say once an animal draws blood, it can't go back." Emma's knees buckled. She pressed her forehead against the bars, tears streaking her face. "Please," she whispered, voice trembling. "Don't take him from me." But no one answered. The ranger stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "We'll transfer him in the morning. You should go home, miss." She didn't move. She couldn't, because through the bars, Ash was still watching her. Not angry, not afraid, just confused. As if the betrayal wasn't his, but hers. When they pulled her away, his low growl followed her out the door, a sound that would haunt her long after the snow melted. That night, the sky hung low and colorless over the valley. The ranger station lights glowed faintly in the distance as Emma sat in her truck, staring at the gate. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Inside that building, behind cold metal and human logic, Ash waited. She could feel it in her chest, the same rhythm that had once lulled her to sleep by the fire, now pulsing with fear and confusion. She wanted to break in, to tear the door open and take him back to the only home he'd ever known. But the sheriff's warning echoed in her head. "If you interfere, you'll be charged, and he'll be put down faster." So she sat there, powerless, watching the night swallow her hope. At dawn, the sound of engines shattered the stillness. 2 trucks pulled up to the station, carrying men in green uniforms. Emma's stomach twisted. She got out, calling across the snow, "Please, let me talk to him one last time." The ranger in charge, a tall man with a lined face and tired eyes, hesitated. "Ma'am, this isn't safe. He won't hurt me," she insisted. "Please." Something in her voice, raw, desperate, made him nod. 1 minute. Inside, the air was cold, sterile. The cage stood near the loading bay, its metal slick with frost. Ash was already awake. He turned his head as she entered, and for a moment, the rest of the world vanished. "Hey," she whispered, kneeling down. "I'm here." He pressed closer to the bars, breathing softly, the faintest sound escaping his throat, a rumble that wasn't anger, but recognition. "I tried," she said, voice breaking. "I told them you're not dangerous, that you saved me, but they won't listen." The ranger cleared his throat behind her. "Time's up." She ignored him. Her fingers slipped through the bars, brushing the soft fur beneath his chin. "Remember the river?" she whispered. "The snow, the fire. You belong there, Ash, not here. Promise me you'll find your way back." He blinked slowly, as if he understood. Then gently, he pressed his paw against her hand one last time. When they came to take him, he didn't fight. He looked back once, just once, eyes gleaming gold in the gray light of morning, and in that look was everything: trust, sorrow, forgiveness. The gate slammed shut. The trucks started. Emma stood in the snow, watching the convoy disappear down the mountain road until the sound of engines faded into nothing. Her body felt hollow, her breath shallow. Around her, the world was unbearably still. When she finally turned back toward her cabin, she noticed something half buried near the path, a single paw print pressed deep into the melting snow. She knelt, tracing its edges with her fingertips, as if memorizing it. By the time the wind rose again, the print had already begun to fade, and with it, so did the last warmth in her heart. The days after they took Ash passed in a blur. Emma stopped counting them. Her cabin felt emptier than ever, each room echoing with ghosts of sound, the soft padding of paws, the low hum of a purr, the crackle of a shared fire. She tried to go on. She cooked, she cleaned, she even played her guitar, but the notes sounded hollow, unfinished. The forest outside seemed different too, muted, restless. The wind chime by the fence no longer sang. It just hung there, motionless, as if waiting for a wind that would never return. Sometimes she thought she heard him. At night, when the fire burned low, she would wake to the sound of soft scratching at the door, or the faint echo of claws on wood. But when she opened it, there was only snow. Then came the letter. It arrived folded in an official envelope stamped Oregon Department of Wildlife. Her hands shook as she read it. The captured bobcat specimen identified as a potential threat has been relocated to the Cascade Wildlife Center for observation. Due to its behavior and injuries, rehabilitation is unlikely. Euthanasia has been authorized for humane reasons. Her vision blurred. The words swam on the page. She dropped the letter into the fire. The flames devoured it quickly, curling the paper into ash. For the first time since her mother's death, she screamed, raw, wordless, breaking the silence that had swallowed her for months. The sound echoed through the trees like an animal cry, wild and grieving. That night, a storm began to rise from the west. The wind tore through the valley, rattling shutters and bending pines until they groaned like old ships. The power went out just before midnight. Emma lit a lantern and moved to the window. Beyond the glass, the forest swayed violently, snow and debris spinning in the air. Then she saw it, an orange glow blooming against the black sky. Fire. Her heart lurched. Somewhere beyond the ridge, flames licked upward, devouring the treetops. She threw on her coat and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and ran into the storm. By the time she reached the ridge, the smoke was thick and choking. The fire had already leapt from tree to tree, racing downhill toward the town. She could hear the crackle of burning wood, the roar of wind, the faint sound of panicked animals fleeing through the underbrush. God, she gasped. No. Her cabin, everything, was directly in the fire's path. She turned back, coughing, and almost stumbled into a group of men hauling hoses and shovels. One of them shouted over the wind, "You can't go that way. It's too dangerous." "My home's down there," she yelled. "Then pray," he said, "because no one's getting through that line." But she ran anyway, through smoke and snow and chaos, driven by something deeper than fear, by instinct, by memory, by love. By the time she reached the clearing, the sky was blood red. The fire was everywhere, crawling over the ground like a living thing. She stumbled toward her cabin, coughing, eyes streaming. "Ash!" she cried, even though she knew it was useless. "Ash!" The name tore from her throat, swallowed by the roar of fire. And then, through the haze, something moved. A shadow, large and graceful, cutting through the smoke. For a heartbeat, she thought it was another illusion, a trick of grief. But then came that sound. low, resonant, familiar. A growl buried beneath a purr. Her heart stopped. She whispered into the flames, "No, it can't be." But the shadow moved closer, golden eyes glinting through the smoke. Ash had returned. At first, Emma thought the fire had tricked her eyes. The air shimmered, the heat distorting shapes into ghosts. But then the shadow moved again, low, fast, unmistakably alive. "Ash!" she cried. Through the wall of smoke he emerged, larger than she remembered, his fur darkened by soot, his body lean with muscle and scars. The glow of the fire turned his coat to bronze, and his eyes to molten gold. For a moment, he looked like a spirit born from the blaze itself. He stopped a few feet away, panting, chest heaving. Their gazes met, hers full of disbelief, his of fierce recognition. She took a shaky step forward. How are you here?" A branch cracked above them, flaming embers raining down. She flinched, and he leapt between her and the falling fire, hissing, back arched. Then, with a guttural growl, he nudged her leg, urging her away from the burning trees. "You came back," she whispered. Her throat tightened. "You came back for me." He growled again, circling her, pushing her toward the trail that led to the river. But the fire was spreading too fast. The path behind them had already collapsed in a cascade of sparks and smoke. They ran together, one woman, one wildcat, dodging flames that clawed at the ground. The air roared like a beast. Smoke burned her lungs. She could barely see, but she could feel him beside her, brushing against her leg to guide her forward. A tree cracked and fell, missing her by inches. She stumbled, coughing violently. "I can't," she wheezed. "I can't make it." But Ash turned back, eyes fierce, and nudged her again, almost shoving her forward. He was limping now. She could see it in the way his back leg faltered. But he didn't stop. He wouldn't. They reached the riverbank just as the flames began to curl around the edge of the clearing. The heat was unbearable. Emma collapsed to her knees, gasping. "Go!" she shouted, waving him away. "You have to go!" He didn't move. "Ash!" she screamed. "Run!" Instead, he took a step closer, pressing his forehead against her shoulder. She felt his heartbeat, strong, steady, wild, and for a moment, time stood still. Then, behind them, came a deafening crack. The old pine tree, the one near her cabin, was falling, a tower of fire and smoke collapsing toward them. She barely had time to look up before Ash shoved her sideways with all his weight. The tree hit the ground with an explosion of sparks, branches crashing across the riverbank. The impact threw her into the icy shallows. Cold water closed over her head. She surfaced with a gasp, hair plastered to her face, lungs burning. "Ash!" she choked, through the haze of steam and smoke. She saw him trapped beneath the fallen branches, struggling to move. His fur was scorched, his breathing ragged. "No." She scrambled toward him, ignoring the heat that blistered her hands. She tried lifting the branch, screaming from the effort, but it wouldn't budge. He looked up at her, those eyes, even now, still calm, still golden. He made a low sound, soft and deep, like a purr through pain. "Don't you dare," she whispered, tears cutting through the soot on her cheeks. "Don't you dare leave me again." The fire was closing in, flames curling around the edges of the riverbank. She gripped the branch again, muscles shaking, and somehow, through desperation, through love, she lifted it just enough for him to crawl free. He collapsed beside her, gasping, body trembling. She dragged him toward the water, half carrying, half pulling, until both of them were half submerged. The cold hissed against the fire, steam rising around them like smoke from heaven and hell entwined. She cradled his head in her arms. "Stay with me," she whispered over and over. "Please stay with me." He blinked once, slowly, peacefully. Then, as the fire raged around them, he rested his head against her chest, purring weakly, as if to say, "I'm home." When dawn finally came, the world was silent except for the hiss of cooling ash. Morning crept through the smoke like a ghost. The fire had finally burned itself out, leaving the forest in ruin. Blackened trees, smoldering earth, and silence where there had once been birdsong. Emma stirred, her body stiff and sore. She was still by the riverbank, half covered in soot and ash. The cold bit through her clothes, but she didn't care. Her arms were wrapped around Ash, his body limp against her chest. "Hey," she whispered, voice raw. "Wake up." He didn't move. She brushed the wet fur from his face, trembling. His breath was shallow, barely there. The once bright eyes were half closed, reflecting the faint light of dawn. "No, no, no." She pressed her hands against his chest, as if she could force life back into him. "You're okay. You're going to be okay. Please." Somewhere in the distance, she heard voices, shouts, footsteps crunching through burned leaves. Rescue teams. But their sounds were muffled, fading. The world had narrowed to the space between her heartbeat and his. Then, faintly, he stirred. His paw twitched, reaching toward her wrist, claws barely grazing her skin. His breathing deepened for a moment. "That's it," she said, tears spilling freely now. "Stay with me, Ash. Please stay." He looked at her then, really looked, and for the briefest second, she saw everything they'd shared. The stormy night they met, the warmth of the fire, the way he'd watched her as if he could see her soul. A low sound rumbled from his throat, soft, broken, but unmistakable. A purr. And then gently, his chest stilled. The silence that followed was unbearable. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of him, the wild heartbeat that had tethered her to the world. Emma bowed her head, forehead resting against his fur, and let herself finally break. By the time the rescue team found her, she was still holding him. They tried to lead her away, but she refused to let go until the last ember of warmth left his body. Hours later, as they carried her to the evacuation truck, she turned one last time. The forest was gone, reduced to ash and smoke. But near the riverbank, she saw something glinting faintly in the morning light. She stumbled toward it, ignoring the rescuers' shouts. There, pressed into the blackened soil, were two sets of prints. One human, one bobcat, side by side, leading toward the trees. She knelt beside them, her fingers tracing the marks. "You made it," she whispered. "You saved me." The wind picked up then, scattering the ashes around her. And for a fleeting moment, she thought she heard it again. The soft chime of her mother's wind bells, carried on the smoke, and beneath it, that low, familiar rumble. When she looked up, the wind parted the haze just enough for her to see a figure at the edge of the woods. A silhouette, four-legged, lean, graceful, watching. Her breath caught. Ash? But before she could take a step, the figure turned and vanished into the haze, leaving only the sound of wings, wind, and the faintest echo of a purr. She stood there for a long time, eyes burning with tears that refused to fall. Then she smiled, a quiet, broken, beautiful thing. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty forest, "for finding me." The weeks that followed blurred into a haze of smoke, silence, and rebuilding. The wildfire had devoured everything: her cabin, her sketches, her past. What remained was a shell of land, blackened and bare, where the forest once stood like a cathedral. Emma stayed in town with Mrs. Kent, whose house had somehow escaped the fire. The townsfolk treated her differently now. No more whispers, no more judgment. Only quiet pity, soft looks and words that never reached the heart. She barely spoke. Her hands trembled when she tried to draw again, the lines uneven and fragile. Every time she lifted a pencil, she saw him, Ash, eyes glowing in the firelight, the sound of his breath against hers, the feel of his fur beneath her fingers. At night, she woke gasping, reaching for something that wasn't there. The doctors called it trauma. The sheriff called it a miracle that she survived. But Emma knew it was something else. It was a promise. When the snow melted and spring returned, she went back to what was left of the cabin. The air smelled of smoke and pine sap. The ground was still scarred, but tiny shoots of green had begun to push through the ashes. She walked slowly through the ruins, tracing her hand along the charred remains of the porch, the melted frame of her mother's wind chime. Near the riverbank, she found the spot where she had held him last. The soil there was darker, richer, as if nourished by the life that had been lost. She knelt, brushing her fingers across the earth. "I'm here," she whispered. "Just like you wanted." Something flickered in the trees. Movement, soft and fleeting. Her heart jumped, but when she looked up, it was only the wind stirring branches. Still, she smiled. That night, she slept outside under the stars, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the forest reborn. Owls hooted in the distance, and somewhere far away, a lynx or a bobcat cried out, a low, haunting sound that carried across the valley. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but for the first time, they didn't burn. The next morning, she packed her bag and walked to the ranger station. The building still smelled faintly of metal and antiseptic. The ranger who had once locked Ash away looked startled to see her. "I'm not here to blame anyone," she said quietly. "I just need to know where he was buried." The man hesitated. He wasn't buried. The Wildlife Center released his body into the forest near Cascade Ridge. That's standard for rehabilitated animals, even after death. "Released," she repeated softly. He nodded. "He's part of it again. The wild, I mean." She thanked him and turned toward the door. Outside, the sun was rising, cutting through the last traces of smoke. For a long moment, she stood there with her eyes closed, breathing it in. For the first time in months, the air didn't taste like loss. It tasted like beginning. Months passed. Spring turned to summer, and the forest began to heal. Green returned where there had been only ash, and wildflowers bloomed defiantly between the cracks of blackened earth. Emma spent every day among those fragile miracles, planting saplings, clearing debris, coaxing life from ruin. It started as a way to survive the grief, but slowly it became something more. The first time she found an injured raccoon near the creek, she didn't hesitate. She brought it home, fed it, tended to its wounds. The creature recovered in a few weeks, limping off into the woods one morning without looking back. Watching it disappear filled her with something she hadn't felt since before the fire: purpose. Word spread quickly. The townsfolk who once avoided her now came with boxes and carriers, stray birds and wounded foxes. They left them on her porch, unsure if she'd even open the door. But she always did. Mrs. Kent visited one day, carrying a wooden sign painted in her careful handwriting: Ash Haven, Wildlife Rescue and Sanctuary. Emma ran her fingers over the letters, her throat tightening. You made this? Mrs. Kent smiled. We all did. Thought it was time you had a home again. Emma swallowed hard. It's not just mine. She looked toward the forest, where sunlight filtered through the leaves. It's his, too. She hung the sign by the old fence, right where the wind chime once was. When the evening breeze swept through, the new sign creaked gently, a low, wooden echo that blended with the sound of rustling branches. Soon, volunteers came to help. They built small enclosures, feeding stations and wooden shelters along the ridge. Emma taught them how to handle animals gently, how to listen to their fear instead of trying to silence it. She spoke of patience, of respect, of how sometimes the wild just needs to be understood, not tamed. One afternoon, a young girl brought her a kitten she'd found near the road. It was trembling, half-starved, eyes cloudy with fear. Emma knelt, taking it carefully into her hands. It's okay, she said softly, the same way she once had on a stormy night long ago. You're safe now. The kitten relaxed, a tiny, broken purr rising from its throat. The sound hit something deep inside her, both tender and painful. Later that evening, as the sun set over the ridge, she walked to the riverbank, the place where the world had ended and begun again. The air was golden, thick with the scent of pine and rain. She sat quietly, letting the sound of the current fill the spaces words couldn't reach. A deer stepped out from the trees, watching her from a distance. She didn't move, and neither did it. For a few long breaths, they shared the same stillness, the same fragile peace. When the wind shifted, she thought she heard it again. The soft, rumbling purr carried through the leaves, faint but unmistakable. She closed her eyes, smiling through her tears. Yeah, she whispered. I miss you too. Autumn returned quietly that year, painting the forest in gold and rust. The air was crisp, the mornings cool enough for frost to lace the grass along the riverbank. For the first time in a long while, Emma felt at peace. Ash Haven had grown into something real, a living tribute. Wooden shelters dotted the hill, trails wound safely through the recovering woods, and the sound of life filled every corner. Birds, foxes, the laughter of volunteers. Children came from town on weekends to release healed animals back into the wild. And Emma, no longer the quiet, broken girl from the mountains, stood among them with steady hands and calm eyes. There were still nights when grief crept in, when she woke to phantom sounds and found herself whispering his name into the dark. But now, the pain carried warmth instead of emptiness. One morning, she woke before dawn. The world outside was bathed in fog, soft and silver. She brewed tea, wrapped herself in her old coat, and walked to the ridge overlooking the valley. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches brushing against one another like old friends. She followed the trail to the river, the same one she and Ash had once crossed through the flames. The water shimmered faintly beneath the rising sun. Mist coiled above it like breath. She sat by the river's edge, watching the reflection of the sky ripple across the current. A single maple leaf floated past, turning slowly in the water, red as fire. Everything ends, she said quietly, but nothing's really gone. Then she heard it, a rustle behind her, soft, deliberate. She froze, her heart skipping. Slowly, she turned. At the edge of the clearing stood a bobcat, not large, not threatening. Its fur gleamed in the dawn light, spotted faintly with gold and gray. It watched her with steady eyes, calm, intelligent, familiar. For a long moment, neither moved. The air between them hummed with memory. Emma's breath trembled. Ash? She whispered. The bobcat tilted its head slightly, just as he used to, then blinked. Slow, deliberate, a gesture that felt almost human. She smiled through the blur of tears. "It's okay," she said softly. "You can go." He didn't run. He simply turned, padding toward the trees with measured grace. The rising sun caught the curve of his back, setting the edges of his fur aglow. And then, as the mist thickened, he was gone. Emma sat there for a long time after, the wind curling around her like a quiet embrace. Later that day, she carved a small wooden marker and placed it by the riverbank. On it, she burned 3 simple words. "You found me." That evening, when the wind picked up and the chimes outside her cabin began to sing again, she looked up at the sky and smiled. Because somewhere out there, in the wild heart of the mountains, she knew he was still watching. No longer lost, no longer tamed, just free. And for the first time, so was she. Years later, when people spoke of Emma, they didn't talk about the fire or the tragedy or the wildcat that once lived in her cabin. They spoke about what came after, the quiet miracle she left behind. Ash Haven became more than a sanctuary. It became a story, a living memory that reminded people how something broken could still protect, still love, still save. Travelers came from far towns to see it, not because it was grand, but because it was real. A small cabin rebuilt from the ashes, a garden that bloomed where the ground had once been scorched, and along the fence, wind chimes that never stopped singing. Children loved to hear the tale. They'd ask, "Was the bobcat real?" And the older ones, those who had once feared her, would smile and answer, "Real enough to change her life." Emma never corrected them. She would just sit by the porch, sketchbook open, drawing the mountains as dusk settled in. Sometimes she'd add a shadow in the background, a feline shape blending into the tree line, eyes bright and kind. At night, when the stars blanketed the valley, she'd light a lantern and leave it on the porch. "So he can find his way home," she'd say. And every once in a while, when the wind turned cold, paw prints appeared near the garden, faint, delicate, vanishing by morning. She never told anyone. Some things, she believed, were meant to stay between hearts, between the living and what the world calls gone. The years softened her grief, turning it into something luminous. She realized that love, real love, never cages or demands. It doesn't belong to us. It passes through us, changing everything it touches. In her final journal entry, written in careful, uneven lines, she wrote, "He wasn't mine to keep. But for a while we belonged to each other, and that was enough." When she passed away, peacefully one winter morning, the townsfolk buried her beneath the oak by the riverbank. They placed a wooden carving of a bobcat at her side, and when the wind moved through the trees, it sounded almost like purring. Years later, hikers who passed through the valley told the same story, that sometimes, in the early morning fog, a gray bobcat could be seen sitting by her grave, watching the sunrise. Not fierce, not wild, just still. No one ever managed to photograph it, but everyone who saw it swore the same thing, that for just a moment, it looked like the world itself was holding its breath. And if you listened closely, you could hear the faint sound of wind chimes. Final message. Sometimes, the wildest creatures don't come to test our fear. They come to teach us how to love,